Good morning, good evening, good day, wherever you are on this fast forward planet Earth, this pandemic planet, and it's a very turbulent planet. A lot of us on this line are focused on climate a lot. Many of those who will be watching and listening today are focused on the combination of risks that we face as human systems and the climate system, and now the biological system of the planet, which has reached out and touched us in a very special way that we're just figuring out how to deal with, collide. There's this concept called compound risk, which is how do you work effectively when you have several complicated factors unfolding at once. And have a great panel here with others coming on shortly to discuss the situation. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Not there physically. I'm in the Hudson River Valley. And I run a new program, a new initiative here on communication and sustainability. And we hold these frequent webcasts to try to make information matter in a planet that sometimes seems to have too much information. That's kind of a fourth factor. There's an infodemic online along with the pandemic. And my job is to see if we can tame it, have the signal cut through the noise. Today, we're going to be talking about an emerging threat in the Bay of Bengal, but it's representative of threats anywhere where tropical cyclones and people collide. By Wednesday, according to estimates, it could be hitting the coast, easternmost India, possibly Bangladesh, and posing an extraordinary threat. And also, this is a region that has some very significant vulnerabilities. There are roughly 1 million Rohingya refugees in camps that Columbia University scientists described helped to map out for landslide and flood risk. The New York Times did an incredible story on that a couple of years ago. So this is a fast-moving subject, and today we're very pleased to have journalists from the region. Joydeep Gupta, who is I've known from way back, who is helping run a Earth journalism network effort and an outlet called The Third Pole, which deals with all that vast intermix of ice and people and water and climate in the South Asia. And Soeb Rahman is here from Dhaka, Bangladesh, who is here joining us by audio because of the limited internet signal there. And several of colleagues of mine at Columbia, who I'll introduce sequentially. I have to fix one thing on my computer for some reason. Let me get out of this. My second screen is locked into something I don't want it to be showing, and I've got to get it to be back to a map. But I'll get to that in a minute. So Adam Sobel is here. He is one of our top climate scientists focused on cyclones, and he wrote a big report very recently, right, Adam? You're muted. I'm sorry.
It came out 2 years ago.
Can you just introduce yourself and your findings briefly? I'm going to pull up that slide as soon as I can figure out how to unlock my other screen, which is doing something funny.
The findings from the report?
Yeah, just tell us what's going on. This started with your tweets a few days ago when you were zooming in, like many climate folks, focused folks on the nature of this cyclone that's emerging. It's not hardly a unique situation. It's a potent storm. I think it was Category 5, expected to be Category 4. But what's your understanding? Just take us through what a typical season is from a climatological standpoint to get that baseline, and then we'll talk about the impacts and vulnerabilities and how to reduce them.
Right. The Bay of Bengal, like the North Indian Ocean as a whole, has 2 cyclone seasons. There's no true tropical cyclones normally during the monsoon period from roughly June to August or September, but there are cyclones both before and after the monsoon. So this is the pre-monsoon season. So May and June is a common time to get them, as is October, November, December. So yeah, this is a time when storms form in the Bay of Bengal. The sea surface temperature now is particularly high, around 31 Celsius, which is about as high as it ever gets on planet Earth. And there's low vertical wind shear, so it's just it's a prime time to get cyclones, and this looks like a pretty scary one.
It sure does, and I'm still going to open up that screen in a minute, but I want to get to Nachiketa Acharya. Is that Acharya or Acharya?
Yeah, it's almost same. It's Acharya.
And what in your title and your focus?
Yeah, I'm basically a climate scientist working and subseasonal. Recently involved with Bangladesh Met Department from last 3 years, working with their next generation seasonal and subseasonal focused. So working very close with them and in touch with different incident like this kind of cyclones. And also, I just want to mention that I'm basically from West Bengal, India, which is right now in the very in a vulnerable situation. And my parents and my family, friends are there. So anything happen in Bay of Bengal, I was always oversensitive, and I'm tracking this thing actually from 25th April, because if we remember, there is a depression in near Andaman Nicobar Island, and it started around 23rd or 24th April, and we expect that it will be moved fast, but because of the climatological nature of any kind of depression during the May, they start from the southeast region for the Bay of Bengal, and then is a long sea travel and goes to northwest. So it took a long time, and that is actually vigorous because it's actually increased his. That I hope it will be like all my family, friends, and others, Indian and Bangladeshi, will be safe, but it will going to be very havoc.
And the region has adapted substantially to typhoon, cyclone risk over the decades. I remember when I was a kid, I had the Concert for Bangladesh album that the Beatles put out, George Harrison. And that was my first experience getting familiar with just how devastating these storms could be in that region. And you look at the reduced losses since then. The region has learned a lot about how to respond. So we'll get more into that in a second. Melody Braun, you're at Columbia University as well. Can you describe your specialty and take us through your sense of the situation?
Sure, thanks. Yes, I'm a senior staff associate at IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. My background is mixed. It's sustainable development, international development, and earth science. And at IRI, I'm the Bangladesh country lead of the Act Today project, which is a project focusing on the development of climate services to support food security. So we're working on improving the quality of information being produced, the translation of that information into something usable by decision makers, the communication and the use. I'm also part of the financial instrument sector team, which is a team working on financial instruments such as weather index insurance. So how to use insurance to better cope with extreme events. And I was also the co-lead with Andrew, who's going to be here in a bit, of a NASA-funded project in the Rohingya refugee camps in the south of Bangladesh, working on how to improve awareness and planification around landslides. And before IRI, I lived in Bangladesh for 3 years, working on adaptation to climate change in the south, actually exactly in the area that is on the track of the cyclone now.
Can you describe that specific area a little bit, just so people have a sense of the landscape and the peoplescape?
Yeah, sure. So there's a mangrove forest in the southwest of Bangladesh that's actually shared over Bangladesh and West Bengal called the Sundarbans. So that usually acts as a buffer when there's a cyclone, but then communities living next to the Sundarbans are very dependent on the forest. They get resources from the forest, and then it's an area that's very affected by salinity. So usually people can't really grow rice as much as they do in the rest of the country, which is why they also depend more on the Sundarbans. There is a lot of shrimp farming, which uses saline water. So it's an activity that adapted in that area. It's an area that, because of the salinity, doesn't have a lot of trees. So the Sundarbans act as a buffer when there's a cyclone. But then after that, people are very vulnerable because there are not as many trees that can protect them. So the areas that I used to work in were very affected by the cyclones in 2007 and 2009, Sidor and Ayla, and some of those communities lost almost everything. The wind is something that destroyed a lot of the villages, but also there was a storm surge. And because the area is organized around polders, which are dikes protecting agricultural land against flooding. A lot of those polders were flooded because of the cyclone, and the water took several years to recede. So when I was there a few years ago, we were still several years after the past cyclone, and some people were still living on the dikes on these embankments because their land was underwater and they were waiting for the water to recede. So yeah, it's an area that's very, very vulnerable to cyclones for sure, and people are already struggling producing enough food for their daily needs, and so when there's a cyclone, obviously everything becomes more critical.
So one of the important things we want to talk about today is the interface between the data and decision making on the ground in different contexts. And we're going to bring in the journalists here in a minute to they're a crucial context too. But I want to bring in Andrew, who works with you, Krushevitz. I hope I'm getting it right. Let's see.
Yes. Yes.
So Andrew, you operate at the intersection of many things. Can you describe that ecosystem of people and institutions that lies between the satellite imagery we were just looking at and the knowledge of the climate scientists and decisions on the ground in such variegated landscapes?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks everybody. So essentially, my background is in meteorology. So coming at this picture from a physical science background has been useful in understanding the complexities and in particular the uncertainties and the limitations of what the data, especially what the forecast data, is telling us. My role in this context is not in making the forecast, but more in understanding the challenges and the opportunities to move from availability of data, different types of data, to integrating that into decision making, in particular for anticipatory actions. For that step of integrating into anticipatory action decision making, I work very closely with a few different organizations that are operating both at local and national levels, but also regional scales. For example, I have a position as science advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center for the past 6 years, and we've been working to develop anticipatory action protocols whereby specific thresholds within forecasts would be linked to actions that would be automatically triggered when those thresholds are reached. And right now, this is happening in Bangladesh. I just was on calls this morning talking about what are some of the early actions that are being taken, and in particular for this situation, how are the early action protocols, which have been established over the past months and years, how are they different now because of COVID-19? So I know we're going to get into that later, but that's been a lot of the discussion in the past few days. Is even when we've developed these anticipatory action protocols, everything seems to be working, but then we have this additional shock that changes the way that we prioritize. And I think to directly answer your question, a lot of my work does go back to understanding the limitations and the constraints, both in the forecast, but also in the policy and on the practice side of taking action where we have the most vulnerable populations. So a lot of my work involves prioritization and deprioritization exercises and communicating the strengths, acting as a broker between the scientists and also down to the decision makers at various levels.
And how much interaction is there with journalists as part of that, or is a lot of this direct to communities and to organizations, humanitarian or preparedness organizations?
Yeah, increasingly there is more interaction with journalists, which I think is fantastic. I think they play an important role in this process. In this, sometimes we describe it as the science, policy, and practice kind of triangle, and somewhere in there for different situations is where we see action take place. And I think increasingly we're seeing journalists show interest, and dedicate their resource and their activities to be part of that. And personally, I encourage that sort of interaction. I encourage other scientists and other kind of translators and brokers to think about how do we work more with journalists to improve not only communicating data down to decision makers, but also the opposite. How do data scientists, how do meteorologists, physical scientists understand more about the nuances and the context of what's going down at the community level and down at the decision maker and policy level as well.
And we're seeing, of course, that same that the essential nature of that being a two-way process is crystalline in the United States right now with COVID-19 response. And as hurricane season comes at us, and actually, Adam, maybe you could speak to the fact that I think there was a tropical storm that popped up in the Atlantic Ocean already well before hurricane season. So we all face that issue of encouraging behavior change that leads to resilience. Adam, what's the latest with our own hurricane season? And then we're going to get to the journalists.
Yeah, there is a tropical storm, Arthur, off of the Carolina coast now. It's as these things go, it's a relatively weak storm, but as you say, it's a couple of weeks before the nominal start of the hurricane season. Hard to say what that means. So this one's not a serious threat to land, although it will affect some people on the Outer Banks.
But it's reflective,
but we'll have some impacts there. So,
in the context of the season and generally, how much do you worry? A lot of your work has been informing coastal communities about risk related to sea level rise, compounded with the hurricane season and the like. When you think about that challenge in Bangladesh and Eastern India, what resonates in terms of how we have to deal with the communities at risk in the United States as well?
Well, everywhere could always stand to be better prepared, but and so that's true on both sides of the world. I don't know what else to say. The forecasts get better and better, and the emergency response in the short term get better and better. But we have global warming too, and sea level rise. So,
right.
Everybody needs to be aware.
And this year, Climate Central recently did a webinar this year mixing. I guess it was the IAEM. It's an agency. It's an organization of emergency managers, and they had journalists and emergency managers in a conversation about the compound risk facing communities with hurricanes and COVID-19. How do you do evacuation? How do you relocate people safely and not expose them to more danger, or is it just a trade-off that we're just going to have to deal with? People will be exposed during evacuations and relocations and centers. It's kind of a murky area. I think we hadn't really thought through a lot of these things. Some people did, but it didn't really translate very widely into anticipatory policy. Melody, does that feel familiar? Or Adam or Melody?
No, go ahead.
Melody, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so Bangladesh has a really good, well-functioning climate cyclone preparedness program, right? The CPP, and it's recognized around the world as being really good and well-functioning, and that's because they have a system to disseminate the information, the cyclone information, all the way from the Bangladesh Meteorological Department to the communities in the field in the south of Bangladesh. And communities know how to read the different levels of alert, and they know exactly what to do. They know when to go to the cyclone shelters. They know where the cyclone shelters are. Obviously, in a situation like this, it's a lot more complicated because you want people to go to the cyclone shelters. I mean, I think there's no other option, but it's difficult. I think what I find interesting is in the case of Bangladesh, the communities have very good access to the cyclone information, but for every extreme event such as the cyclone, but other extreme events as well, you have so many different activities in different sectors that are impacted at different levels that, for each of those activities and levels, you have decision makers who are trying to make the best possible decision. And they're often doing that without necessarily having access to all the information available or without necessarily understanding how to use it. And I remember being in that situation actually when I was working in Bangladesh, and I had so my project was in the southwest of Bangladesh, in that area. I had 5 staff in the field, and one day there was a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, and we got the alert. I was sitting in Dhaka, and we know that the communities will go to the cyclone shelters, but the staff of the project wasn't from that area. So do you expect them to go to the shelter and then potentially take the space of other people who don't have any other option, or do we evacuate? But if you evacuate, when do you decide to evacuate? When is the trade-off between, when do you decide that the risk is important enough that you will evacuate your staff? Where do you evacuate them? You have to have a good enough understanding of the track, or like a good enough confidence in the track that you know that you're not going to evacuate them to a zone that's at bigger risk. When is it safe to evacuate? How long before landfall? You don't want, how do they evacuate? You don't want to ask them to get on their motorbikes, which was the way they were moving around, if the cyclone is too close. So there are all these questions that are not necessarily, are difficult to answer even if you have access to the right information. And I remember sitting in Dhaka with my colleagues in Bangladesh and thinking, how do we make that decision? We don't have that, we don't have that answer. I think now with COVID, there's this additional layer of questions that people might have, and it's unprecedented. So I'm not sure we even have all the answers at this point.
So now I'm going to bring you through some journalists, and Jodeep is already on screen, and I'd love to have them either ask questions or offer some observations related to this discussion. There's, and I'm going to show this, hold on. Here's the website of Earth Journalism Network. The third pole is this fantastic enterprise in that part of the world. And Jodeep, can you describe a little bit just the general history of what you do with Earth Journalism Network, the third pole, and then we can talk about the role of what do we need? I'd like to have, by the end of this hour or 90 minutes, to have at least 2 or 3 new partnership ideas or the like that might come out of this, because you guys use data a lot as well. So Joydeep, you have the floor.
We do. Thanks, Andy. And thanks to all the scientists and experts who have been speaking. That was very useful. Thanks very much. Yeah, okay, since Andy wants me to talk a little bit about how we are connected to the Journalism Network. The third pole is a joint project, actually, of the Journalism Network and China Dialogue, which is our sister website, which looks at environmental issues in China. We look at environmental issues in the entire Himalayas and the basins of all the rivers that come down from the Himalayas. So, yeah, the Bay of Bengal coast of West Bengal and Bangladesh, the Arabian Sea coast of Pakistan, the Indus, that is the Indus Delta. Those are definitely part of what we're looking at. And yes, we have been covering cyclones, and Soeb, who I assume will come online sometime, is our Bangladesh editor. I'm the South Asia director.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, and I know historically the Earth Journalism Network has been very focused on some of the basic environmental issues like pollution, fisheries. Soeb, who's going to come on in a minute, has done some really good fisheries stories. Climate, obviously. But COVID-19 is kind of it isn't at the heart of what that community reports on. So when you think about compound risk, and you think about the what you've been hearing from the folks here, what would be an urgent challenge? What would you like the journalism networks that you work with would be thinking about or trying to do in a new way?
Yeah, so we have been, now in India, now it's what, 55th or 56th day of a lockdown. And the lockdown in India is very much more severe than what you're used to in the US. So during this period, we have been, but somebody said it was death by boredom and then death by webinars. So we've been doing loads of webinars. But many of them were about the interaction between health and environment, especially starting with how zoonotic diseases affect human health and how zoonotic diseases are partly caused by environmental degradation, and then what happens. So as journalists, we know that when we do stories on whether it's climate change, pollution, water, deforestation, the stories that get maximum traction are when we actually correlate it to human health impacts. That's always the case. So we have, I won't say a good idea, but we have some idea of health issues, and we're trying to improve that now for ourselves and for the hundreds of journalists we mentor. Yes, that's the answer to your question, Andy.
Is there something lacking that you would like to see? You know, at Columbia, at the Earth Institute, and the various components here, IRI and Lamont, and the folks who work with NASA, we're working on a couple of initiatives to try to better connect the data resources there with journalists on the ground in various developing countries where they might not always have access to good data on some of these background trends, like that work that Melody was describing related to landslide risk in the Rohingya camps. Could you foresee, does it feel like a felt need to have some more access there? And this relates also to sometimes government data isn't always reliable, or the way the governments present it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say in almost every developing country, and especially two that I know of in South Asia, there is not only an issue of data gap, there is also a major issue of data equity. Now, I live in New Delhi, so I lives in Dhaka. Melody's lived in Dhaka. Dr. Acharya lives in Dhaka. Our ability to get data is far more than the person sitting in the area where Melody used to work, Satkira, for example, and good usable information, which is something we have been really concentrating on in all the media capacity building workshops we've been working with, we've been conducting, as to how to get the local journalists how to give them more resources, how to give them the links that will help them. And yes, there's always scope for a lot more. Right now, because of the lockdown due to COVID, this particular year, so far we haven't had that other problem which we get every year in this part of the world, which is air pollution in the summer. But that problem, I'm afraid, is going to come back. And air pollution data, again, is very, very iniquitous. We get a lot of information on big cities. We get almost nothing from small towns.
Right.
So that kind of stuff would be very useful.
And that's, there's a role there for distributed technology. There's another group at Columbia led by Faye McNeil and others. There's a clean air toolbox for cities, and they're trying to create, it's only a limited number of cities at this point, but they're trying to create that capacity with some pretty simple instrumentation you can have at the local level to get PM 2.5, which is a key issue in developing countries, especially because of biomass cooking and burning fields and the like. So it's not even just an urban issue. And that technology can be pretty cheap. So it's kind of, I think we're poised for some big progress there. Does anyone in the science end want to weigh in? It might be fun to have a follow-up close focus discussion with the Earth Journalism Network and some of our gang here. Yeah, Andrew.
I have a question. Hi, Joydeep. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for your comments. So something that what you shared resonated with me is the idea of how do we tell stories of resilience? Now, how is that newsworthy? Because in theory, the story is that nothing happened. And what I mean by that is, if we take anticipatory action on short lead times or longer lead times building resilience, I mean, there's nothing to take a picture of necessarily, because what we did worked, and there's a combination of policy, of science, of getting down on the ground and understanding how to best allocate resources. But how do we tell that story? I mean, with disasters in journalism related to disasters, it's very much like we're having this large impact and now people are coming in to save the day. Like, how do we switch to telling the story and having people interested in that? Wow, like we're doing a really good job and life is normal. How does normal become news?
Oh man.
Okay, and Andy will know what I'm talking about. All of us journalists are desperately looking for positive stories because we just don't get enough. We don't get enough good positive stories. We don't get enough good stories on resilience. What we get, especially, I know this from my own experience in South Asia and Southeast Asia, what we get are sporadic, so-called best practices, which sort of fall down the moment you try to scale up or scale out, and that is what you do a story on it, and then you find, oh, this thing was dependent on one person who was leading it. He or she has retired, and then that's it. We have had far too many examples of this, so we tend to be a bit skeptical. But yes, genuine stories of resilience, which can be A, scaled up, and B, scaled out, are most welcome. Please let us know.
Yeah, and that, by the way, that issue, we've been on Twitter, have been very actively, and on sessions of this program, discussing that in the context of COVID-19. It's the same phenomenon. The right behaviors are very boring, and it's very hard to prove a negative. And journalism is all about the outlier. We focus our cameras, particularly cameras, and our tweets on those who are loud and noisy, those carrying guns into the Michigan State House, those, attacking a journalist on the front lines. And we don't really have a good way of describing the opposite. And that the Solutions Journalism Network is another group that we're working with to try to figure out how to do exactly what Andrew was saying. How do you, and to me, I think part of that is really more at the community scale. It may not even be journalists' role. It's like community to community. What can we do to foster capacity for them to tell their own story? Just say we are sheltering in place, or we are using a different way to evacuate our village. I think there's a lot of potential there. Melody?
Yes, if I can add something, I think this is a really good discussion, and I'm actually very interested in connecting with your network as well, because so one initiative that we developed 2 years ago in Bangladesh as part of this project that I work on, and in collaboration with the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and the Wheat and Maize Improvement Center. So we were talking to stakeholders, and people kept saying, there's a disconnect between the information that's out there and the way decision makers use it. And there's a need for a transsectoral dialogue on climate services so that people from different backgrounds can talk about it, come together and figure out, what is out there, how to use it. So we created the Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services, BACS. And what that does is we convene stakeholders around specific issues connected to climate services. And it can be, the importance of integrating climate information in policies. We had some events with the government. It can be on insurance. It can be more broad, but we're also doing capacity building trainings, and we do 1 week-long capacity building training every year. We had one that was pretty general on food security, one specifically on aquaculture, and it's all demand-based. And we're really in the process now, after 2 years, after having run 2 of those trainings, we start having a big community of alumni, and we're really talking about how do we tell the story. And the whole point of those trainings is people come. We start the trainings by discussing how their decisions are impacted by climate, and then progressively what they can do differently once they understand the information that's available. And so we really want to document what they do with that information when they go back to their normal life at the end of the training. So we're in the process of starting a new series that's led by ECAD in Bangladesh, documenting those stories. But we're very interested in discussing more about what are good ways to do that, because obviously the point is really to follow up with those people who have followed trainings, to see if they're getting what they need, to see how they're changing what they were doing before, how are they communicating this information to others. And we've got some feedback here and there from different people showing that they're using it, but we want to find better ways to communicate it in a more systematic manner. So we're going to start the series soon, but I'm very interested in more discussions on that for sure.
That's great. I'm happy to help.
Happy to help. And you are working with Dr. Huck, and I was very happy to see that line from him over here. And as long as you're working with Dr. Huck, you're doing fine, because he knows just about every journalist in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I agree.
And beyond.
Yeah, we can do a subsequent session on this. Dr. Kicha.
Yes, I have a question for Jaydeep. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Dr. Acharya.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know why my screen is frozen. Anyway, so I have seen like a general tendency, but maybe I'm wrong, but I've seen like those stories about any kind of extreme events. Whenever there is a forecasted by Met Department, there is like a general tendency to the public that don't believe those forecasts, because they're always talking about like the history of the prediction scale is not good. But as you know, from last 10 years or 15 years, there is a huge improvement in the climate science. The forecasting ability is a hugely improved. So how journalists can actually help to, that to remove that confusion to the public, that the Met Department has really had a good ability now, especially for the tropical cyclone. I have seen last 3 or 5 years in BMD, excellent improvement with the, and also, as you know, from the IMD, there's a huge improvement in the cyclone track prediction. So how a journalist can fill that gap?
Dr. Acharya, frankly, I think you are a little bit behind the times, because that particular credibility gap has been more or less bridged. Today, I know almost no journalist in either India or Bangladesh who does not take the forecasts of BMD and IMD seriously. Those jokes about, if they say it's going to rain, keep your umbrella at home, they're a thing of the past. Because we are perfectly aware that both BMD and IMD have improved their capacities a lot, especially when it comes to events like cyclones. And we have proof of that. I mean, if we hadn't seen that kind of forecasts available, we wouldn't have a super cyclone where only 3 people died. I mean, it's not possible unless you have excellent forecasts. So I'm not too worried about BMD or India Met Department not having credibility. They do have credibility. Where they have a problem, and they do have a problem, is that their outreach to journalists, their outreach especially to journalists in small towns, they need huge improvement. I know they have small comms teams and they keep trying, but they need to do a lot more.
And what could that look like? I know in Dale Willman, one of my new colleagues at Columbia here in my communication initiative, worked in sub-Saharan Africa, where SMS and, well, obviously WhatsApp is a significant interface between institutions related to agriculture and climate stress. Actually, people at Columbia are working on that too. So, is that?
Yeah.
What's the frontier there?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, for the last 3 days, all the cyclone stuff from India Met Department has been coming on WhatsApp. And now the thing is, there are hundreds of journalists who are getting it on WhatsApp, and it's really helping them, and they're doing good stories. But there are hundreds of others not there. So that is a logistical thing that they need to figure out.
Well, we should work on that. Yeah, Andrew, again.
Yeah, just to add something. No, thanks for the comments on this. And I think building off a specific word that Andy used, the frontier, and I think one of the frontiers is also more related to the idea of trust and privilege and understanding how to prioritize one data set or one forecast or one risk map over another. I mean, with the abundance of social media, it's very easy to share data, and it's very easy to share, let's say, official looking data, that may not be official, or data that comes from a source that may have mandates at a different level, such as regional level, that might be the same as national level official data, but it might also be different. Then you have international, like global decision makers, policy makers that would probably like to use the national level data and or the regional level data, but they have access to global products that in some cases may actually be better than what's available at the local scales. Then what do you do when these data sets don't tell the same story? So there's two things. So it's one is understanding the abundance of data and understanding what is our responsibility as people who understand the constraints and opportunities that are inherent with that data, but also understanding the chain of dissemination from the data scientist / climate scientist through what is usually happening now, this broker position, down to people who are actually saying, well, you know what, I have this storm surge risk map for the next 3 days, and this district to the east, we're not going to take early action because we have limited resources, and we have to pick 2 districts right now. We have to pick 2 districts first. how do we prioritize those two districts, and how do we use data to tell the story, and how do we use the right data that's mandated so that we could justify not only prioritizing early action, but deprioritizing early action in other areas. And that is really difficult. And it has a lot to do with availability of data, but it has even more to do, I think, to do with understanding our responsibility and privilege in disseminating that data in a way that we can make sure is actionable, but also respectful of the process of what it means to take action, to do something.
That's so interesting.
This is a genuine problem, actually. But in the case of cyclones in South Asia, in the Bay of Bengal region, it's not so much of a problem, because more or less everybody is going by the two official Met departments. But it is a genuine problem, for example, that I face while covering landslides in the mountains. Landslides in the because well, the Nepal Met department is not as strong as Bangladesh or India. So, and we do get conflicting data from Nepal Met department and the NASA satellites going overhead, and we have to then try to figure it out. Who do we believe, and to what extent, and how do we do that? It's a problem, all right. It's something that I suppose only experience can help, and you burn your fingers, and that's how you learn. I don't know what else you can do. There are another very contested data terrain is forest fires in the mountains. You get a lot of different data sets on forest fires and the extent. Almost all the time you get a NASA data set which shows much wider forest fire than your own government, national governments show. And that's a problem. Yeah.
The thing you just described, that you both just described, that's a challenge, is it's not just, it's this sort of, how do we have the exchange conversations and interface work that can keep testing new ideas, getting the right information to the right place in the right way. And no one funds that. Where's the money for that? This is Andrew Kay's domain. And I look over and over again in the COVID-19 case, the Laurie Garrett, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, wrote a piece for The Lancet, a medical journal, lamenting how little money at the World Health Organization, which is already struggling for money, goes into communication innovation, communication, monitoring social media. And it's a fraction of the overall budget of most organizations to even think about the interfaces you're all talking about, and that I think are really important. So I don't know if any of you have ideas for how we can have a better outcome in building that kind of interlaced conversation in a sustained way too. This is not just like writing a report and saying we need more blah blah. It needs to be more actual engagement. I don't know how that works. Anyone jumping to the foreground here with an idea?
Yeah, I think the incentive structures need to change. I mean, it seems like there's a growing appreciation for that role, both from a data science side, climate science, geophysical science side, and also from a policymaker and a decision maker side. Both sides are realizing it's very hard to speak the same language, and it's very hard to find that common ground. So we're having this new kind of type of people emerge, and I mean, IRI is a group that has a lot of these people. You know, some people our expertise is rooted more in the economic side, or the geophysical side, or the communication side, sustainability side of things. But everyone has a variety of skills. And I think just being pragmatic about it, that doesn't gel well with the way that universities define who you are and define your career path.
Right.
My students, for example, in the Climate Society program, it's very nice when they ask me, they're like, wow, you do cool work. Like, I want to do the stuff that you do. Like, seriously, it's like such a nice feeling. And I try to encourage them to do this sort of work, but it's very hard for me to say that it's going to be like a clear way forward. Like, what am I going to say? Oh, well, yes, you could study you could go on to study remote sensing or meteorology a little bit more, and then spend some time in the humanitarian space, or do the opposite. And it's not very convincing for graduate students that want to do it, but they also went back to grad school and they want to have a career. They want to have a career path. So I think there's an opportunity for Columbia, especially with the new climate school, to take this seriously, to answer the call from scientists and users and policymakers to better define this role. And I think there's no other place like Columbia and New York to lead the charge.
Oh, I'm with you on that. And when I think about other institutions that I really have loved as a journalist over the decades, NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, they were depopulating their social science side. I had to write an article for the New York Times to get Mickey Glantz, a great social scientist who worked at that lab doing all this great climate modeling, to keep him employed. I wrote a story for the New York Times, and he got employed at the University of Colorado. It's still, even the social sciences seem discounted, but maybe not here, which is good news. Melody, you had you had an idea.
Yeah, I just think we really need to break the silos, because we're still, IRI is an organization where we have a lot of mixed backgrounds, people coming from different places. But I think often, in my experience, you have organizations that are focusing on like the climate science, or organizations that are focusing on humanitarian response, or organizations focusing on the development. And you can't really be trained on all of that at the same time as an individual. So you need an organization that has those people from different backgrounds, or we need to develop background, like master's programs, education programs that are allowing people to try a bit of these different things. Because it's right now it's very difficult. You need to have two organizations working on specific things, working together, so that you really maybe have a chance to bridge this gap. But we need to mix it up a bit more. I think we really need to mix it up more. And so I think what's important is having more of that transdisciplinarity within organizations, but also people like at IRI, for example, we have those different backgrounds and we are working in different countries. But what we're really trying to do is identifying actors on the ground in all the countries where we work that are able to get that transdisciplinary understanding, like that are able to take a step back and say, okay, I understand enough of the science and I understand enough of the decisions, and I'm going to be a champion, a local champion. And then those people can go and pass the message. And I think we need to develop structures in those countries, and we need to work with the countries to develop those structures so that the local champions can play that role. We build the capacity of people on the ground who are playing this translation broker role. That's what we do with ICAD and Dr. Haq in Bangladesh. And those organizations are really more able than us to play that role in the country in the long term, once all the projects are over.
That's great. In the United States, there's been an initiative. There was a question that came in, as you could maybe see here. Natalia Elieva says, do speakers have any experience in working with national broadcasters to build their capacity to use data, prioritize data, and to translate it to understandable reports? She is Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union. Sounds like another partner we should reach out to. Joydeep, have you ever worked with them? Do you know them?
Many years back, yes. I've just put in the chat box that the answer is yes.
All right. Well, let's. I'm gonna, when this is over, I'll mark that. Yeah. And in the United States, as I was saying, there's a group, including ClimateCentral.org, that had worked with broadcasters to do trainings on how to build climate resilience and climate change insights into their broadcasts on meteorological phenomenon. That's obviously an exportable model too. We should think about some of that. I wanted to pause briefly because I wanted to get Adam to just walk us through a little bit of the specifics on Cyclone Amphan. I think it's Amphan locally. Is it Amphan? Yeah. Hold on, let me just get that screen up. And anyone who's online watching, please share this live with other folks. We have another good almost 40 minutes to go, and please share this with people in the region or wherever you are, if you're thinking about the interface of climatology and human resilience, especially in a time of pandemic as well. So hold on.
Andy, just to let you know, like our colleagues from BMD, they are also online in Facebook and sending some comments. So just
great.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. And again, this is the beginning of a conversation. This series of webcasts just started. I started it March 15th on a Sunday afternoon when I realized there was a gap that needed filling, and so we're going to keep going. Adam, maybe you can walk us through some of your what you've kind of pulled together here, just as the general situation with this storm.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I just got a bunch of stuff off the internet from different sites, including Bangladesh Met Department, India Met Department, and some American sites of what the storm's doing now and what the forecast is, pulled off as of a couple of hours ago. So if you want to go to the next slide, please.
I'm going to do it in a funky way because I can't get it to work exactly the way I want. But there we go.
That's fine. So that's an infrared satellite image, enhanced infrared. So it works at night. Although this was early this morning, I believe. India time. No, sorry, afternoon India time. And so it shows the cyclone, very symmetric, very powerful storm. At this time, diagnosed to be 140 knots, or I think around 220, 230 kilometers per hour. So that's category 5 on the American Saffir-Simpson scale, and on the North Indian Ocean scale, it's super cyclonic storm. So this is about as, in the highest category that storms can get. And I don't know if you can see the coastline there, but it's somewhere off of
here
between Andhra Pradesh and Odisha to the west, and Bangladesh to the north. So if you go to the next one, this is a microwave image. So I don't want to explain it too much, but just to say that the storm, I'll get to the history in a moment. It underwent a very, very dramatic rapid intensification yesterday, became a lot stronger. A couple models had predicted that, but most had not. And there may have been an eye wall replacement cycle going on. And I think you can see a hint of that here with one small, this is later after that, but if you look close in, there's near the pinhole where the image has a blank spot, there's one eye wall and another one outside it. It's a bit of a scientific curiosity, but these things can cause the intensity to fluctuate. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. So let's go to the next one. So this is the history of the track and intensity. So the latitudes and longitudes aren't much help unless you look at a map, but I want you to look at the intensity on the right-hand column and the time is on the left-hand column. So this is in knots. So at the most recent time, you see that 140 knot number, which is the beginning of the category 5 US scale. But just to look between yesterday, between 12 and 18 universal time, excuse me, you can see that dramatic jump from 75 to 115 knots. So that's a 40 knot intensification, or maybe more like 45 mile per hour intensification. And that's high enough to be considered a rapid intensification, which is always something that forecasters are afraid of, both because it's hard to predict and because when it happens near land, it of course means a worse forecast for those whom it's going to hit. So then it kept intensifying a bit more after that, another 25 knots between then and now. So it's a very, very powerful storm. So if you want to go to the next one.
Yeah, I remember recently in the United States, there have been several situations where rapid intensification before landfall was a big challenge to predict. So I guess that's still kind of a hard nut.
It's getting a little better, but it's still a challenge. And some of our research and others shows that most storms that reach very high intensities at all in their lifetimes, most hurricanes, I should say, tropical cyclones that reach high intensities, do so after at least one rapid intensification. So in other words, very few storms get to high intensities just completely gradually. So in some sense, predicting rapid intensification is closely related to problem to predicting just intense cyclones. So this is track guidance. So this is from different numerical models being run around the world and then collected at a US site, the National Center for Atmospheric Research that Andy mentioned. But this data is available to forecasters everywhere, including in the North Indian Ocean region. And so this shows different tracks of the center of the storm from different models. And you can see this is actually a pretty tight ensemble, with most storms, most models coming up through either the western coast of Bangladesh or of West Bengal, India. A couple strays going toward Myanmar or Odisha, but most coming up there. So although still definitely some uncertainty about landfall point, it's much less than it was a day or two ago. Somebody's asking, do we think it will reduce intensity before landfall? The answer is yes, but we'll address that in the next slide. So if you want to go ahead. Oh, sorry, not the next slide. We'll get to that in a minute about the intensity. Okay. This is the track and forecast from the India Meteorological Department. I should say the IMD, Regional Specialized Meteorological Center, Delhi, is the World Meteorological Organization designated center for the North Indian Ocean, so they support Bangladesh and other countries in the region. I'll show the BMD, some BMD stuff in a moment. But so the cone of uncertainty, although people often interpret it, have problems interpreting it, that cone does not indicate the region that will be affected by the storm. Right. The center track is the IMD's most likely forecast path of the storm's center, and the green area indicates the sort of the probabilities. I mean, based on historical forecast errors, the center is likely to be somewhere in that green area. But the main track, the most likely track from IMD, takes it landfall over the West Bengal coast, and the center actually almost directly over Kolkata before heading inland and up towards northern Bangladesh. But you can see the range of possibility there. So if you go to the next one. This is wind probabilities. So these are this is some measure of the area of likely impact. So if the track stays on that center line, this shows the likelihood of different places getting winds of different strengths, with the brighter colors indicating higher strengths. And I actually can't read the scale right now, but because it's too small on my screen, but they're given down there, and these slides are all available. At the end, I've given links to everything. So you can go and look at the originals, or Andy can distribute these slides if that's helpful. Sure. So just to say, there will be high winds, over a large region, probably including Kolkata, if this proves correct. So do you want to go to the next one, please? This is a similar map from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. So this is a U.S. Military site that forecasts for the U.S. government, but they put their stuff publicly online, so I'm not sharing anything I shouldn't share here. And their main track is the same, and they're also giving wind radii of respectively 34, 50, and 64 knot winds, 64 knot being the threshold for U.S. Category 1. So their landfall, the track is very similar, and the wind radii are very similar, just to show that the different forecast centers are in pretty good agreement on what's happening, as they're looking at the same set of models, which are also in pretty good agreement, at least as far as the track. I think I have intensity. Let's see, what's the next one, please? Oh, this is storm surge.
Very, very important in that region.
Very important. So this is storm surge from IMD. And so the red colors are like 5-meter storm surge, which is a huge storm surge hitting, especially to the right of the track in the Sundarbans, which Melody talked about earlier. So, for anybody near the shore in this region, this is very low-lying flat areas. The storm surge gets some distance inland, and this is a very serious forecast. The numbers specifically for some districts are given at the bottom there. So this is run by INCOIS, the Indian Center, but distributed by IMD. So very, very serious storm surge forecast from India. I'll show the Bangladesh one in a minute. Can you go to the next slide, please? I think maybe I didn't put the intensity ensemble, but I could send that if I didn't. Anyway, this is the. Do you want to go back up to that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is whether the Bangladesh Met Service doesn't, as far as I can tell, doesn't produce a graphical cone like the India one does, but this is a quote from their text-based forecast, which gives some of the districts likely to be affected. They give much lower storm surge numbers, 4 to 5 feet above normal astronomical tide. I'm not sure if this is because they're forecasting from different places, or they're running a different model, or what they're doing, but that's a difference. And they're giving wind speed forecasts of 140 to 160 kilometer per hour in gusts at the time of landfall, which is quite a bit lower than now. So everyone's forecast weakening. And I guess I didn't send the track guidance, but I'll just say that if you look at the, well, actually, we could look at it. Yeah, if you go to the next links, let's see. Maybe it would be instructive. So these are I took stuff from all these sites.
Yeah.
Let's see. If you go to the NCAR forecast model guidance one, and then, oops, that didn't really help, did it? Maybe this is not going to be so easy.
Well, that's okay. We can, I think.
Yeah, at any rate, I can describe orally what it says. It basically, some of the models that predict intensity hadn't yet caught up to the current intensity. So in other words, they're not, they haven't recognized how strong the storm is now. But the models that have started with the current intensity keep it this strong for somewhere between 24 and 48 hours, and then it starts dropping just before landfall. And so the really, really critical question is how rapidly the intensity will decay at landfall. Some of the forecasts have it around between 90 knots or maybe 100 at landfall, which would be high U.S. Category 1 or low Category, high U.S. Category 2, low Category 3. So still quite a powerful storm in terms of winds at landfall. Of course, it's a large storm also, so rainfall, in addition to storm surge, is a flooding threat. And so, for example, Kolkata doesn't get the worst storm surge because they're quite some distance upriver from the coast, but a lot of the cities below sea level and could definitely have rainfall-induced flooding. One of the other links I put on that last slide is to the Bangladesh Met Department, which has an animation online of some of their own simulations. If anyone wants to see that, it's what individual realizations of a model. You can see what their model's projecting for what the storm looks like. But that's all I prepared. So thanks.
No, I appreciate that. And before, I think Nachi, you have to go shortly to another webinar. Like we're always in this mode. Is there some final takeaway you have on? Not so much this particular storm, although this will be in the news through this week and beyond, the general challenge and opportunity to go forward. What would a dream landscape of communication and data and impact on the ground look like? Do you have a sense of that? And, what are we driving toward here so that when a storm like this emerges, there's more responsiveness and less impact and less news, as Andrew was saying?
Yeah, exactly. As Melody and Andrew described, that in IRA you have a different set of expertise, and I'm mostly working with the climate service and actually working with BMD very closely to improve their capacity building. So right now, we know, the storm is come, and people are focusing for 5-6 days, but it will always better to have a 15 days or 20 days window to have some kind of signals. And we are working on a project called subseasonal forecast, where we try to, maybe we don't get the track probability in that range, but we can get the signal of high rainfall. And we're working with BMD, and probably it will be done within a few months from now. And also I just, just a little bit of touch base of how IRI and BMD has an excellent work relationship nowadays. And we actually, thanks to BMD to give that opportunity to us, and we are actually helping them to have their next generation focus system, which is mostly, as Andrew shows, mostly their focus coming in a text, which is not that much of helpful for the decision makers. And it's mostly on the subjective based consensus focus, but we are actually working with them to have an objective based focus system, and it is now online in their website, and they improve a lot in their seasonal focus. So I also hopeful that in very near future, they also have a kind of very objective based subseasonal forecast of that kind of tropical cyclone. And on that note, I must say, sorry, I need to leave because I have another focus forum. And actually it started, I'm 5 minutes late on that.
Oh, no. Okay. We'll let
Thank
you go.
Very much, and we'll be in touch. And Joydeep, I really like to contact you in personal note. So thank you very much. Bye.
Great.
Folks.
And we can follow up again. Take care.
Absolutely. Yeah, please get in touch. Not a problem at all.
Hold on. So I want to bring in a couple more of the journalists who've been patiently in the green room. And Adam, I'm going to minimize you so that I can get Sahana in here as well. Sahana, you can turn on your camera. So we have Soheb Rahman, who's in Dhaka, and Sahana Ghosh is really a great journalist involved in these stories in the region as well. Sahana, can you describe where you are and a little bit of your background?
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me here. And hi, Joydeep. Hi, everybody. So I work with Mongabay, India. And so in terms of, the coverage that we do, and I'll specifically talk about extreme weather events and disasters. So we've looked at environment health. We were discussing environmental health aspect just a few minutes ago. So we've actually looked at environment health aspect in quite some details. When you talk of extreme weather events, we've looked at mental health aspects as well, and also we've looked at how children and women respond and react to these specific events. And so what Andy said earlier about social scientists. So what we have also observed is that in a lot of our reportage, also we've tried to get in social scientists as well, linking the climate science with the social science data as well. And for us, the challenge is that we are not in the business of daily reporting. So we can't report, what's happening today, what's the forecast that IMD is giving out for today, for tomorrow, what's happening essentially on a day-to-day basis. So we have to really sort of aggregate the data over the, say, when a cyclone makes a landfall, and then we have to see what has happened with, just not the number of, say, deaths or the infrastructure damage, but we sort of have to get in the climate science into that, because simply, our stories have to have that rich amount of data, that those rich details, because we don't do necessarily report on the day-to-day happenings in terms of extreme weather events. Another thing that we are doing is we are looking at satellite data, how the mangrove cover has gone down, the health of mangroves in the Sundarbans, for example, and how that is linked to extreme weather events. So all those projections, what's going to happen, say, in the next 20, 30 years. So we've been systematically looking at those projections. The other aspect that we are also looking into is resilience. How certain groups, how, say, groups of women, how they are creating these resilience funds, say, along the Orissa coast. Or what are the other examples of, you can call them solution stories. So we are looking at these solution stories, like what are the other examples of resilience for communities, and the communities are themselves sort of coming up with these ideas. How are they scaling up those ideas? How are they scaling up those projects? So we have looked at those examples in, say, along the Orissa coast, along Bengal, and other places, other parts in India.
I have a question for you and Soeb and Joydeep about this. Is about the idea of engagement journalism, where the history of journalism has been telling the story, right? I and you go out with your pad and we take a picture and we distill and then we write a story and post it and we tell the community its story in a way. And I've gotten more and more convinced that journalism can have much more of a role in essentially being the place where community can engage with science and with journalists and in a way tell its own story. I kind of brought that up earlier. I don't know, Joydeep and Soeb, also if you have some thoughts about new models of journalism that just aren't so much about us, meaning, you know what I mean, the actual printed page or digital page.
Yeah. I think I would like to hear Soeb on this. He has been working with citizen journalists. Yes.
So let's hear Soeb. Let's see if he's there. He's muted right now, so I'm hoping he's there.
Yes.
Oh, there.
Yes,
yep. Okay. Good.
Yes. What did you say, Joydeep? Just I didn't get you.
I said, can you tell us, because Andy's question was, what can we do to bring the community voices more directly up into the public domain, right? And you've been working with citizen journalists, you've been
Yes.
working with communities. So tell us about it.
Yes. Yeah. So let me just give you a very brief intro of myself, and then I will talk about that thing. So I started my career as a journalist, then moved to the development sector. I worked with UN, IUCN, International Water Association, Oxfam. I worked, now I am the Bangladesh editor for Third Pole, and from Third Pole, I'm working for one of the EGN funded project called Bay of Bengal. And now let me give you that answer, like how we are dealing this kind of things. Like if you look at the media landscape of Bangladesh, you'll see like all the good journalists, all the in-depth writers are sitting in Dhaka. But the climate change is happening in the coast. Climate change is happening in the coastal Bangladesh. So there are also reporters, but who actually do not know the skill, who do not have the access to data, and who do not know actually who to go to get the expert opinion, you know. So what we did from our understanding and what we did from our research is that we need to go to those reporters who are actually reporting from the climate change impacted regions of the country, and we are bringing experts and people from the community in a room, and and we arrange face-to-face meeting with the journalists, so that at one hand they are getting expert opinion in front of them, but at the same time they also have examples from the community people in the same room. So it's like verifying experts opinion with the community, and hearing from the community, verifying their problems with the explanation from the experts in the room. And also what we are doing is connecting this journalist with the experts, because you see there are some charismatic, there are some common experts in Bangladesh, but the experts who always speak in their expert language, they do not speak
Right.
in the language the way the journalist should write a story, you know. So that's how we are also working with the experts, and we're also working with the journalists, so that both of them come on a common with a common language, so that that helps the journalist to write stories. At the same time, the stories that we are doing for our side, we're also translating those stories into our own languages, so that the journalists who are actually working in the coastal regions or the other climate vulnerable regions of the country, or the hard to reach country, can understand those stories and get excited with those ideas and write stories from there. So that's how we're kind of building a network of scientists, journalists, and also community representative.
The other thing I love about the third pole concept is it's sort of biogeographic regions. The regions are not defined by country. It reflects what's going on in each country. The reporting can reflect what's going on in a country, but you're talking about watersheds, river basins, coastlines, where it's fundamentally shaped by those environmental realities. I think that that's one of the great innovations I think Internews and Earth Journalism Network have done in recent years. You can see there's Info Congo, there's Info Nile in the Nile Basin. I love these platforms because they're engaging journalists across borders also in projects that are great. Mongabay does some of this too. Sahana, you write for Mongabay, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Mongabay as another example? And I'm hoping this can resonate with the scientists on the line, so we can see if there's ways we can have more, regular interface between among these entities.
Yeah, with Mongabay, we've also worked with EJN, with Earth Journalism Network. I've done a couple of stories for EJN, and I got a grant from EJN. So Mongabay supports these kind of collaborations as well. When you talk of the work that we are doing, we stress a lot on engaging with scientists. In terms of how do we communicate the science to an audience, that may not be aware of what's happening in climate science, and also to sort of create an empathy that why should the audience care about these kind of stories. And this is where we bring in the human aspect. This is where we bring in the people, who are part of these extreme weather events, who have survived, who have dealt with these extreme weather events, be it tracking the migrant community from the Sundarbans, who are now returning, what's happening with them, or going to the spot, and sort of looking at what these people, what kind of resilience networks they are building themselves. So it's connecting the science with the people. And as I mentioned earlier, that we are getting in a lot of social science as well into our stories. Because, satellite data, how do you communicate satellite data to an audience that does not, that is perhaps not clued in to what satellite data is, and why is satellite data important? So I think connecting science with the human aspect is something that we regularly look at. With COVID-19, for example, we have looked at how different states in India are tweaking their SOPs, how they are accommodating people in cyclone shelters because they have to practice social distancing. So what are the ways and what are the lessons that states have taken from their disaster management plans, and how they have adapted it to sort of tackle COVID situation? So so we as journalists also, we've evolved in the sense that looking at disasters in terms of the humanitarian crisis and then linking it to the COVID-19 pandemic as well, the dual challenges that state governments across India are now addressing. As we speak, we spoke about the cyclone. At the same time, in Assam, for example, the state government is dealing with the onset of floods, and so they had to tweak their SOPs as well. So how do you go from just covering disasters or extreme weather events to also seeing how these plans can be adapted to tackling COVID? And as journalists, I think we've looked at all these issues together. Whether it's the onset of infectious diseases right after the monsoon season, together with the COVID-19 pandemic, together with the impacts of an extreme weather event. So so there are these multiple dimensions to a disaster as well.
Yeah, and that's a hard story to tell too. We all like to focus on one thing at a time. What I like about what I'm hearing from my colleagues at IRI and Lamont is that intersectionality, that you can have a map with more than one dimension. And actually at Columbia, there's another group, CISIN.org. They are mapping population data in real time, flows of people. And even within Columbia, sometimes it's hard to get these entities to talk to each other. One of my goals in this conversation is to have not just the conversation today, but then, okay, tomorrow, what can we build offline to make this interface more actionable? Joydeep, I think you were signaling you have a thought or a question.
Yeah, I actually have a question which Sahana just mentioned about, and I wanted to ask Andrew about this because you have been working with Red Cross, Red Crescent, and presumably you will know about cyclone shelters and details of spacing within cyclone shelters. As Sahana mentioned today, we just heard that because of COVID-19, instead of 3.5 square meters per head, you have to have 7 square meters per head in every shelter, in every flood shelter. So my question to you, and even to Melody, because she's got the experience from those cyclone shelters in Bangladesh, do we have 7 square meters per head in those cyclone shelters?
Yeah. Melody, do you want to go first?
I don't have an answer. I would assume no, but I can't tell for sure.
It's such a weird feedback mechanism. I mentioned Climate Central a couple of months ago did a session with American emergency management officials and some people focused on hurricanes and journalists, and the emergency management people, and there were a couple of people from different states. They basically said their default is go to the shelter and we'll worry about the disease aspect. But when you think about the ramifications of that for the perpetuation of the infection and contagion, it's very troubling. You could end up with these hotspots just reverberating and reverberating.
Yeah, because Usually you put about 50 people in a truck and take them to a place, a shelter, and where they're packed worse than sardines in a can. That's the usual way you do cyclone shelters.
Yeah.
How on earth are we supposed to do it in the middle of COVID?
So, I mean,
I just want to make a comment here. So what I have come to know is like in Bangladesh, in total, we have around 4,500 cyclone shelters, small and big and medium size, in all over Bangladesh. And that's not really enough for the people, even in this COVID situation. And the fact is, like, when people go to the cyclone shelter in Bangladesh, they do not go alone. They also bring their kettles. They also bring their other essentials with them to the cyclone shelter. So what this was asked today, the minister was asked by the journalist today, like how the government is going to deal with this, and they said like they are trying to convert all the concrete buildings along the coast, schools, colleges, and madrasas into cyclone shelters. I am surprised to hear that. And they're trying to, they will start evacuation right from tomorrow. And in the meantime, they will disinfect these concrete buildings along the coast. So that's the situation in Bangladesh.
Wow. So we'll just see how this plays out. And then maybe we could talk about the Rohingya camps too, a little bit more. These hotspots where you've already seen the infection popping up. I don't know, Andrew, or I know Melody, you had been involved in those analyses. Is this just going to have to play out? Are we just going to see this disaster happen, or is there anything that can be done ahead of time?
So yeah, Andrew and I were co-leading the NASA-funded project in the Rohingya camp, which was before COVID. So I'm not directly involved right now, but I mean, even before COVID, we had these discussions with decision makers in the camp about what are the kind of decisions that can be taken when there's a cyclone alert, because everywhere else in Bangladesh, people know that they have to go to the shelters, but in the camps, people are not allowed to evacuate the camps. So then what's the kind of decision that you can make? I mean, they still have alert systems. People know what are the different categories of alerts, but there's not as many options that you have because you can't evacuate the camps. And now with COVID, I believe a lot of with COVID and the restrictions associated to it, humanitarians didn't have as much, they were limited in their ability to prepare for disasters because they had to limit to essential activities. And in a refugee camp of, there are about 1 million Rohingyas in that area. So you can imagine that there are a lot of activities that are essential. So because of COVID, my fear is just that they're less prepared than they would have been without that. They might have had less opportunity to prepare the way they would have. There's no way to evacuate. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. People are already extremely vulnerable because they're sharing bathrooms and water sources. And then with extreme events, there's an additional risk of contamination of water. Obviously, there's the very high proximity because the density is so high. People are already vulnerable they already have health issues that are not really addressed properly because of the situation they're in. So it's just an additional layer of vulnerability with less ability to respond compared to non-COVID crisis.
So we're getting toward the end here, but again, this is to me the beginning. I don't think this conversation has happened before between journalists in region there and scientists with a lot of data and expertise. So I think it would be fun to go around the circle here one time and get a to-do list going for how we could move ahead. If maybe we'll start with Joydeep. You've been very generous with your time here too, and if you could jot down something that articulate something that feels like a next step here, that would be great. Is it getting some more? Who is not in the room here now who could make a difference too? That's something I always like to ask. So Joydeep, what do you think when you think about a next step, a next conversation, something that can be actionable?
Yeah, so in this sort of a thing, always the people who are not in the room and who need to be there are the policymakers. You will end up with the scientists and the NGOs and the journalists, and you always miss out on the policymakers and the politicians. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. We try our best to get them in, and I have never succeeded. So yes, but that's something that maybe the reputation of Columbia can be used for this purpose.
Well, we do that sometimes at events. We'll have world leaders come to campus and stuff. And now online, I think there are probably ways to nudge people toward that. Andrew, this seems to be your realm. You're like that intermediary, the interlocutor. What would be a next step? What conversations are not happening that and connections are not being made that could be made?
I think that there's a lot of discussions happening. I mean, this is a unique discussion, but there's the idea of breaking down silos and improving communications across disciplines and encouraging the voices of the most vulnerable communities to be part of the process. I mean, these are discussions that have been happening for many years. It's just we haven't figured out how to establish well-defined next steps in a way that incentivizes us to move forward and to incentivize resources in a way that we can effectively collaborate and do something about it. I mean, I think that to me that's what a lot of this comes down to. However, with COVID, we have an opportunity to take action, and I think we have to take action. And we also have the opportunity to remember that if we're going to change the way that decision makers and community voices are integrated into science, we have the opportunity to do it in a way that speaks towards the concept of a broader change in social justice and dynamics, and make sure that is central to the way that we change this. And I think it has to do with a change in the way that academia works, a change in the way that policymakers integrate the results and interact with research organizations, but very much in addition, very much incentivizing these sort of interactions in a substantive way, not just having webinars and having meetings. I mean, we have a million conferences, but how do we develop and incentivize and promote and reward these sorts of activities at the interface? And for that, I don't have an answer, but I think we need to start thinking more about what that would mean.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of something that came up in a very different context, which was at the level of national intelligence a month ago. And here I've had a couple of discussions about COVID-19 and the difference between information and action. And it came down to these global threat analyses that the government gets, that they generate, these intelligence officials, don't result in actually testing the case. In other words, running the drill. Saying the only way you'll know if your inadequate supply of ventilators is also not well maintained is to be taking that information down the chain and running the exercise, as you said, kind of actual things happening in an anticipatory way. That's even at that level, it's not happening. So there's a lot of work to be done. So again, let's just, I don't want to take more time myself. Sahana, what would you like to see that could make your life easier as a journalist in this arena?
So I think sensitivity in reporting. How do we make our reporting more sensitive? You know, when we write on communities, write about them, and when we quote them in terms of, say, whether we are covering dual challenges of COVID-19 and extreme weather events, are we being sensitive enough in the way that we portray them? What are the pros and cons, you know, when we get community voices out? Are we inadvertently propagating some stereotypes, you know? Maybe if there are certain guidelines, you know, I know that IGNet and others have put out guidelines on how to report more sensitively on the COVID-19 pandemic. But then in terms of extreme weather events also, can we be more sensitive in the way we report? While at the same time, you know, we do not do away with the key elements in our reportage, but can we be more sensitive?
And that builds trust and engagement with your audiences.
Exactly.
That seems like an important thing. Soeb, any last thoughts from you? I'm sorry, the internet access is limited, so we can't meet you face to face, but it's great to have you here.
No, I agree with Shahana. Whenever we are writing stories, are we really listening to the community, and are we really portraying the community's voice, and kind of, explain in a way that the science also, we also bring issues of science, but it's very important, like how we portray the stories, how we portray the voice of the community. That's very important. Otherwise, people will not actually read the story. My articles will not connect my readers if I do not look at from that lens.
Melody, what's the next step here?
So the discussion that we're having now is really something we have discussed with the partners of the Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services. The goal is really to help different sectors have access to the knowledge and understand it better so that they can talk about it better. We actually had discussed at some point having a training for journalists. I mean, we have many ideas, there are many things to do. So that's definitely something that I would like to discuss further with, together with the partners of the Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services. But what's interesting too is, we're doing a lot of trainings in person, and now with COVID, that's limited. For us, obviously, we can go to Bangladesh, but even for our partners in the country, you can't organize a training at the moment. So we're also thinking a lot more about online trainings and creating materials. And so going forward, I think it's really important that we all stay in touch and we think about how we can better, connect the dots, and maybe how we can be better at integrating the journalism community in what we're doing. The Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services is part of the Gobeshona network, which is a broader network, bringing together researchers on climate change. The ECAD has a lot of initiatives to communicate information. So they work with the Dhaka Tribune, and they post something called the Climate Tribune. I believe it's once a month. So we're trying to explore the different avenues on how to better integrate journalists in how to communicate information. And you're right, Shahana, you said, is there a way to be more sensitive? And we're seeing in Bangladesh that, there are a lot of ways that we can slightly change the message. Like a lot of people are talking about climate change, but there's also a lot to discuss about climate variability, because there's a tendency to look only at the end of century scenarios, not necessarily at shorter type of information. So there are many ways. I think the Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services could improve that, working with all of you if you're interested. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's a wonderful way to close out, because I think people forget when they think about climate change. As you say, it's a monumental challenge with no real simple action points. Solving climate change doesn't really have any meaning, but vulnerability reduction is something that can happen in real time on the ground in a community with things as simple as a better communication system, or thinking more creatively about how to have pop-up evacuation opportunity spaces or the like. So climate vulnerability. In fact, I wrote this once or twice. I think the world might have been better off with an intergovernmental panel on climate vulnerability or climate risk than on climate change. Not that climate change isn't an urgent priority, but it can distract from the things that we can do today. And I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation today to get this all moving forward. There have been some excellent comments coming in that I'll follow up with as well. I would love to have Melody email around that possible partnership with the Bangladesh Academy for Climate Services. It feels like a real opportunity to build an actual actionable interface between journalists and decision makers and data. So thank you all for being part of this today. I'm going to read a little bit of a closing boilerplate that I'd like to conclude on. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment, and it's the one today that allowed us to link Bangladesh, India, and the United States here, with all of us dispersed in places as well. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. There's a hashtag, SUSTCOM, so #SUSTCOMM. For the time being, these sessions will focus on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of COVID-19. But as you can see today, there's a broader landscape of risk and opportunity that we'll be working on consistently. These happen every few days, and every Sunday we try to recharge by having the Sunday session on songs and poetry. I'd like to get some contributions there also from Bangladesh and from South Asia generally. So that's how we, the rhythm of the week. Thank you to everyone here from IRI and Lamont and Internews and Mongabay for participating today. It was great to have you together. Joydeep, I know we've been trying to do this. There's so many other angles that we need to pursue. I'm happy to do sessions on this particular theme regularly. Thank you all for being part of this, and Adam Sobel, who and Nachi, who had to drop off for other obligations. And stay connected from a distance.